Like you said, my name's James. I'm one of the youth leaders. If you haven't met me, I think all of you have met me, hopefully, at this point. But I've been here for a couple years now, and I'm here to talk to you today about one of the worst people in the Bible, who is also my favorite person in the Bible, and it's Peter, the Apostle Peter. By the way, I chose this picture because all of this century art is terrible. Like, look at his face. Like, no one's face is like that in real life. Like, I've never seen somebody that just like looks like that. It's insane. So that's why I love this century art. Anyway, so this is the Apostle Peter. How many of you guys have heard of the Apostle Peter? Good. All right, he's a pretty big player in the Bible, right? He's a good guy, right? He does a lot of good stuff. Helps found the church. Well, I'm here to talk about like his entire life and just all of the terrible decisions he makes that lead him to being the person who brings the good news to the world, and how God uses his terrible decisions, and I mean some of them are pretty bad, just to bring the good news to everybody. So let's start. So the beginning. This is where this set of verses is where we first meet Peter. Yeah, sure, we'll read it out loud. Sorry, that was just me trying to figure it out. As the crowd was pressing in on Jesus to hear God's word, he was standing at Lake Gennesaret. He saw two boats at the edge of the lake. The fishermen had left them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, which belonged to Simon. Simon is Peter, FYI. He eventually gets his name changed to Peter by Jesus, but right now his name is Simon, and asked him to put it out a little from the land. Then he sat down and was teaching the crowds from the boat. And when he was finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch." "Master," Simon replied, "we've worked hard all night long and caught nothing, but if you say so, I'll let down the nets." And I'm going to pause. So first of all, what do we know about Peter? We know that he's a fisherman and he owns a couple boats. That's about it. But what is that? But in context, what does that tell us about his life? From already just that little section, we know so much about Peter. Namely, he's a fisherman. But what that means, but really, so in modern day, all of our jobs kind of don't really mean anything. We're all kind of around the same social class. I mean, there's variations in like, as there will be, and a lot of it just deals with like what kind of car your parents drive or what kind of house you live in. But in reality, like, we all have so much here in America that like somebody who is a fisherman versus somebody who is, I don't know, an astronaut, we're just going to go those two extremes, can basically do the same things. They can go to the same restaurants provided they have the money and all that. They can just walk around. That's not the case back then. Back then there was a class system. So Peter was a fisherman, which meant he was in the low-tier class. He wasn't down into slavery level, but he was in the bottom tier of classes, which meant he didn't have the luxuries that anyone else did. He couldn't go to certain parts of the city because they were reserved for higher class people who worked in the marketplace or stuff like that. So he had to basically be sat in this lower class and restricted on where he could go, on who he could marry, on who he could hang out with, and all of that. It's very different than how it looks nowadays, where if I was to say that if Jesus were to come nowadays and pick up somebody and a fisherman, it wouldn't be a really big deal. It'd be like, yeah, he's a fisherman. Cool, my dad's a plumber, like whatever. It's like, yeah. But back then, Jesus picked Peter, who was a fisherman, who was somebody in the lowest level of class, who couldn't rise up, who wouldn't be looked at if somebody from the crowds looked at him. They wouldn't think he's a good man, he's a strong man, he's going to preach the word, and he's going to be affluent in his preaching. He's not. They're going to look at him and be like, oh, he's a fisherman, which means he's probably grumpy, because when you spend your entire life doing a trade that's essentially based on luck, I assume you have a lot of grumpy days. I mean, how many of you have been fishing? Now, hopefully you were smart and you had the luxury that I have when I go fishing, that I bring a backup dinner, because I know for a fact there's about a 50% chance I'm not catching any fish that day. Now, imagine doing that, but doing that as your sole source of income. where like every day you went out and you could be using the right nets, you could be using the right baits, still like a 50% chance that you actually come home with any money that day. Now imagine how that would make you feel. Would you be a happy person? You can like,
I'd be stressed out.
thank you. I don't know, I would probably go insane. I know I would go insane. I can't even imagine what that is like. And yet, Jesus chooses this guy to be his disciple. Just starting at that is already incredible. The life of Peter is already starting out just insane. But as we continue on through the first couple verses, we notice that Jesus asks to speak, and he gets out in the boat, and Simon Peter lets him get out in the boat, and he speaks. But when he's done speaking, Jesus comes out back and asks Simon for something. He says, hey, I want you to go put your nets back out and catch some fish. Now, he had just spent a day not catching any fish, which if you've ever been fishing, a day of not catching fish, the last thing you want to do is go out and try and catch more fish. It just sounds, it's just awful. So this guy goes up to Peter and says, hey, I want you to go try again. Go catch more fish. And Peter goes, okay. But I don't think, the first few times I read it, I was like, oh yeah, whatever. He just listened to this guy. Can you imagine the depth of obedience it had to take to listen to a guy who comes up to you, who has the nerve, after he just like took your boat for a solid couple hours to preach. He took your boat, and he comes up to you and says, hey, go back out there and fish. Would you say yes? Would you look at him and be like, yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a good thing to do. Or would you look at him and be like, yeah, right, I'm going to go home and go to sleep because I'm going to try again in the morning. But he does it. And he does it because he heard Jesus preach. Now, we don't know what Jesus said in this sermon. It was probably amazing because it's Jesus. But it was enough that when Peter heard it, and this guy just comes up to him and says, hey, go out and catch more fish, he says, okay. And he does it reverently. It can be read as like flippant, where it's like, but if you say so. But the fact that he says master is reverent. It means it was done reverently. It wasn't done out of flippancy. It was just, he was actually saying, all right, I'll do that. Just already, the amount of faith Peter has is astounding. That he hears a guy speak once. So what does that say about our path of being a Christian? Many of you, all of you, because we don't have any new people here tonight, have heard the gospel. You've heard it from Bryce, or you've heard it from anybody else who's spoken, or you've heard it at church. You've heard the gospel spoke. So you had a choice. After that, you had a choice of Jesus, through the gospel being preached, looks at you and says, are you going to obey me or not? And we're all like Peter in this way. We all heard it, and we all were given a choice. Now, a lot of you, I hope a lot of you, I know most of you, have chosen to obey because you're here. If you wouldn't be here if you hadn't chosen that, so I'm really grateful for that. And then, when you choose to obey, you should know the reward that comes out of it. Paraphrasing the next few verses, you can read them on your own. He goes out after not catching anything all day and catches too many fish. So much fish that he has to call a second boat out to come help. So much fish that when they put all the fish onto both of those boats, the boats start to sink. This is an aside for all you math nerds out there, because it's me. Do you know how buoyant boats are? You know those giant cargo ships who literally have like thousands upon hundreds of thousands of tons of stuff on them? Tons being 2,000 pounds, 200,000 pounds, I apologize. All those giant ships, they never sink. Now imagine, if you've ever been in a canoe, you can load a canoe up pretty well, right? You can put a ton of people in a canoe, it's not going to sink. Now how much fish would that have to have been to make both boats sink? It's the depth of the reward that we get for following Jesus. All he did was say yes to a guy who asked him to go out. It's no different than God speaking to us, than his gospel being revealed, and us saying, All right. You know what? I will. I will go to church. I will try and follow after you. All right. And look at the reward we get. It goes on. Peter's reaction after getting all this fish is to fall on his knees and repent in full repentance and to follow God. Because again, this guy who just told him to fish after he'd caught nothing all day just asked him, hey, from now on, you're not going to be catching fish, you're going to be catching people. I prefer the other translation saying fishers of men. You will be fishers of men. It sounds a lot better. So he tells him, you're going to drop absolutely everything. The entire life that you know. Now, you're all young. Most of you were probably born and raised in Vegas, I assume, right? Imagine being asked to leave Vegas and everything you own to go to someplace, Istanbul. It's the first place that came into my head. To go to Istanbul and just follow somebody. Would you do it? I mean, if you had just seen a miracle and like probably thousands of fish come out of the water, I think maybe I'd say yes, but it'd be difficult. But what does Peter do? They brought the boats to the land, they left absolutely everything, and they followed him. This man who has known nothing his entire life except fishing. He has been grumpy and angry because his entire life is based on luck. He follows Jesus. And that's how, just in our walk with Christ, that's what God tells us to do. He tells us to set aside everything and follow him. So already, Peter's starting out great, right? It's like, yeah, dude, this is a good guy, right? Wrong. Next slide. So struggle, part 1. Set the scene real quick. So Jesus had just been praying, because after John the Baptist dies, Jesus goes off to pray by himself, and all the disciples go out on the water. This humongous storm picks up. It starts tossing the boats around, and they're all terrified, absolutely terrified. Let me reiterate, Peter's a fisherman. He's a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee, which historically has tons and tons of storms that rock boats. So he has probably seen his fair share of rocking boats in storms. So what would it take for a man like Peter to be terrified? Nothing short of probably a hurricane or a tornado in the water. Probably. I'm not going to assume the weather that day, but I assume it was big enough that it made these fishermen pee their pants. So already, we're at this part where Peter is being tested. And the disciples saw somebody walking towards them. And the first thing they scream is, it's a ghost. And I think that's hilarious that it's still translated like that. They just go, ghost! Ah! And it's funny. It's funny in my head. But when Peter hears it, and he hears him say, no, it is I, do not be afraid. Peter goes, oh, that's right, I have faith. I know this God. This God brought thousands of fish from the water. I've been following after him for months, not up to a couple of years now, and just, I'm going to follow him. And he steps out onto the water. And what happens? I didn't put it in here, but spoiler alert, what happens when he steps out on the water? He walks. Jesus is walking to him on the water. The God of the universe is walking to him on the water, and he steps out and he starts walking towards him. And again, wonderful moment for Peter. Oh man, what would it be like to walk on water? I mean, you've all thought of it. I've thought of it. You ever thought that you could run fast enough across a pool that you could just like run across the water? You ever tried it and then fallen and hit your head? Good, me neither. So just, Peter's walking on water. Peter has so much faith in God. But then what happens? Peter looks down. For a moment, Peter looks down and realizes he's walking on water. And he becomes terrified. And he begins to sink. He loses his faith. Here he is in the middle of a crazy storm with a dude walking towards him, and he is walking towards that dude, and this dude is the God of the universe in human form. It is no better moment to not lose your faith, in my opinion. You are staring at the face of Jesus and already walking on water. Like, you know it's possible. It's not like he had to jump in for the first time. He already is doing it. He knows it's possible, and yet he's still afraid. And Jesus looks at him after he catches him and says, "Why did you doubt?" And again, is that not just a perfect picture of our faith? Where we have seen the goodness of God. We know how good his following after him is. We've been living it. We've obeyed. We've gone for it. And yet we still fall. And yet we still see everything else out there. We still want to take something. We still want to steal. We still want to hang out with the wrong friends. Despite seeing how perfect and good life is, we look over and we just can't help it, right? So in this moment where Peter could just not sin, could just not be afraid, staring at Jesus, and yet he still is. So that's the first. Not the first. There's many that I'm not including in this sermon, but that is one of many of moments of Peter just losing faith in God. So this next one, struggle part 2. So they're in Jerusalem, or not, they're not in Jerusalem, I apologize. They're about to go to Jerusalem, and Jesus is talking to them, and he's saying, here, this is what's going to happen in Jerusalem, which, spoiler alert, Jesus dies in Jerusalem. Jesus is going to get crucified, he's going to get beaten, he's going to get mocked. He's going to go through this insanely horrible, horrible thing. And Jesus tells the disciples this beforehand, says, hey, by the way, just letting you know, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, they're going to whip me about 30 times, and then I'm going to bleed everywhere, they're going to put a crown of thorns on my head, and they're going to hang me up, and it's going to be awful. You guys ready? And Peter looks at him and says, no, that's not going to happen to you. They use the word rebuke, which, if you didn't know, because I didn't, I had to look it up, it means sharp disapproval or criticism. So it's not just like a, no, God, you're going to be fine. It's like a, no, that's not going to happen to you. You're Jesus. Imagine telling that to God, to the man who created everything, who just like put you on the earth and everything on the earth, and then told you, hey, this is what's going to happen. Imagine looking at him and going, no, I disagree. It's like, what? And God throws it, like, God calls him out on it, or sorry, Jesus calls him out on it. They're the same person. It's difficult. Jesus calls him out on it and says, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me because you're not thinking about God's concerns, but humans' concerns. Satan. Oof. You just called him Satan. Oh, again, this is Jesus, who is perfect, calling you literally the devil. How does Peter feel? How would you feel? But how is that not everything that we already do as Christians? I'm going to keep pulling it back that Peter is the perfect example, one of the perfect mirrors of our path of being a Christian, of that we can fail so much, especially in this. God tells us that something's right. God tells us this is the path I want you to take. This is the way I want you to go. And we say, but it's not, though, and we do something else. Whatever that may be. We are constantly rebuking God, whether we know it or not, in the choices we make. As I'm saying this, I didn't realize how much of a downer this would feel. Like, this is kind of a downer. Spoiler alert, it gets better in the end, so hopefully that picture spirits up a little bit, but it kind of should be a downer. This is the path that every Christian takes. It's not just unbelievers who sin. It's not just unbelievers who do this. It's every Christian. It's me. It's you. It's Bryce. It's Pastor John. Literally everybody will sit there and look at Christ and be like, no. It's even Peter, who drops everything to follow this man who told him to go fish. Fails. Next slide. Struggle part 3. This is the best one, and this is probably the one that you're all familiar with of Peter, and it's the denial. This one is the hardest one. Because in the past, sure, Jesus tells him, hey, I'm going to die, and Peter says, no, I don't want that to happen to you. And maybe he's saying that because he loves Jesus, and he doesn't want him to die. He's still sinning, but he's doing it from a good place. In the other one, he's out on the water, he's out in the middle of a storm. Can you really blame him for getting afraid, right? This one is the one where you cannot blame Peter. You cannot justify this. As Jesus is talking to the disciples on the day before he dies, he tells them, truly I tell you, tonight before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. He tells that to Peter. And then Peter says, even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. And all the disciples said the same thing. They looked at him, and he looked him in the face and said, I'm not going to do it. Jesus is like, you're gonna turn your back on me. Peter goes, no, I'm not going to. And with such conviction, too. It's not like he's not just like, nah, I would never do that, bro. He's like, no, even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. Then we fast forward. Jesus is in the courtroom getting mocked. One of the people, as Peter was sitting outside, a servant girl approaches and saying, you were with Jesus. He says, no, I don't know what you're talking about. Again, somebody else comes up to him. This man was with Jesus of Nazareth. Nope, Jesus the Nazarene, sorry. And again, he denied it. I don't know that man. You really are one of them, since even your accent gives it away. He started to curse and swear an oath. I don't know that man. And immediately the rooster crows. If you just put yourself in that place, put yourself as Peter, because, spoiler alert, you are Peter. Jesus had less than 24 hours ago told him, you will deny me 3 times. You can forget a lot in 24 hours. You probably won't forget that. And Jesus, who is in the courtroom being mocked and beaten, Peter is, A, already not doing anything, which is kind of rough to think about. But B, somebody comes up to him and 3 times in succession asks him, hey, you were with him. No, like, I can hear your accent. You were with him. And he says, no, every single time. And immediately the rooster crows. It gets worse if you look at Luke. In Luke chapter 22, verse 61, Luke's account of this says, immediately Jesus looked at him. And we're to know, Peter was sitting outside, so probably far out of earshot of Jesus, who was at this moment getting yelled at and beaten up as well. So probably couldn't hear him. Probably didn't even know what was being said. But Jesus knew. Jesus looked right at him. Again, that's us. If you can't already see that, if you can't look at this and think of a time that you have, that God has told you what to do, and you know what's the right thing to do, and you swear you're not going to do it, you know, but you do it anyway. It's the same thing as this. You can just picture Jesus looking at you right after you're done. And the guilt, the terrible, terrible guilt Peter must feel. And it's the same guilt every one of us feels. Now, like I said, this is the worst. This is probably the worst things Peter's done. And I hope I've already convinced you, Peter is not without his faults. So why did I go through this? I didn't want to make you feel guilty. I don't want to make you go home and be like, oh man, I don't know if I want to come back to church. That was rough. I did this because there is so much joy that comes out of our depravity. I want you to get how terrible Peter is in this moment right now as we go to the next slide, as we see his redemption. This is in Acts. Jesus has died. He's gone to heaven at this point. He's died, resurrected, and gone to heaven. And they're in Acts, they're spreading the gospel around the world. Peter is the one who has a vision. Jesus comes to Peter in a vision and tells him, I'm going to have you spread the word of the Lord to the Gentiles. The Gentiles are people who did not have the word of God before. They could not follow Mosaic law because they weren't Hebrew, they weren't Israelites. So they did not have a way of salvation. And Jesus comes to him and says, hey, I want you, the fisherman from Galilee, the man who denied me 3 times, the man who tried to tell me what to do, the man who lost faith and sank into the water. I want you to go spread the word to people who've never heard it, the people who could never hear it before. I want you to go bring salvation to the rest of the world. And he does. I'm not going to read this whole thing. It's really good, though. You should definitely write that down and really read it. But it's only through Peter that we get this. And as Peter speaks in here, it's beautiful and it's wonderful, and he shows this love and depth of God. And that's why Peter's my favorite person in the Bible, because he's so terrible. He's so bad. And God uses him to bring the gospel to the world, to bring salvation, to bring the good news of everlasting life to the world. And I have to think, if he can do that with Peter, what can he do with me? What can he do with you? If he can do that with somebody who's terrible, so me. If he can do that with somebody who falls away from God all the time, so me. If he does somebody who literally, after being told what to do, does completely the opposite, again, so me, what can he do with me? Face it, the only reason I'm standing here, the only reason any of us are standing here is because of Peter. Not Peter himself, because of what Jesus did through Peter. But that's the only reason we are here. And that's why Peter is by far my favorite of the disciples, probably my favorite person in the entire Bible. And it's just, it's wonderful. The bottom line here is, guys, that God uses broken people. God will always use broken people. That's seen throughout the history of the Bible. It's not just related to Peter's story. Off the top of my head, King David, literally committed adultery with a lady he saw bathing, then immediately had his best friend killed. Sorry, maybe not his best friend, I can't remember correctly, but that lady's husband immediately had him killed because he was embarrassed. That man is a descendant of Jesus. That man built Israel into the great country it was for a little bit. There are so many examples of just broken people in the Bible. People who can't hear but can do wonderful things. Gideon, who was terrified, or who was the afraid little boy, who ends up leading an army and conquering. That's the takeaway is God uses broken people. He will use you. He will, like he uses me, like he uses Pastor John, like he uses Bryce. He will use you in glorious, God-fulfilling ways. So that's it. That's the take home. So let's pray.